Next, let's think about the ways in which heavy metal and alternative were sort of extended in the 1990s, that is, starting with the core of what was happening in heavy metal music and alternative and adding to it. And one of the most important things to start happening in a very kind of regular and stylistic way during the 1990s was the real fusion of rap and rock, where you'd have what otherwise seemed like a rock band, but the singer would often rap many of the vocals, sometimes singing some of them, sometimes screaming some of them, but rap sort of really made its way into a rock band kind of context in a more sort of thoroughgoing way, perhaps, than had happened up to this point. Maybe one of the biggest bands to sort of help this transformation really take hold was a band called Rage Against the Machine, coming out of Los Angeles, California. As I say, blending hard-driving rock with mostly rapped vocals, the rock coming in many ways via the inventive guitar playing of Tom Morello, and the rapping coming from vocalist Zach De La Rocha. They were influenced by earlier groups, who we'll talk about just a little bit later in this week's lectures, groups like Faith No More and the Red Hot Chili Peppers, especially in the way in which they use grooves and things like that in the music. But the big debut album, Rage Against the Machine, only went to number 45 in the charts here, number 17 in the UK in 1992, but it was already a blueprint for what the group was going to be, a dedication to political causes, the musical style, all of this thing sort of already there apparent on that first album. But with the 1996 album, Evil Empire, Rage Against the Machine really break through into the big time. A number 1 album here, number 4 in the UK, and of course they go on to have success later in the decade as well. Coming out of Bakersfield, California, otherwise famous for a style of country music during the 1960s, led by people such as Buck Owens, we get a group called Korn, spelled with a K. These guys really kind of make one of their trademarks the 7-string electric guitar. Now, they weren't the first ones to use a 7-string electric guitar. 7-string electric guitars had been used by jazz guitar players, oftentimes adding a high string on the top to give the guitarist a little bit more range under a single grip to do sort of more piano kinds of things. Older guitars, classical guitars, that kind of thing that had added extra strings would often add the notes on the bass end to give you a little bit more ability to play low bass notes while you're playing high on the neck. The 7-string electric guitar here adds an extra bass note and adds that really, really low kind of sound that is so much a part of that music, that sort of very low, sort of heavy metal-y kind of sound that's so much a part. And so these guys, Korn, the 2 guitar players in the group, James Monkey Schaefer and Brian Head Welch, these 2 guys really make this 7-string guitar their own, even though, as I say, they didn't come up with the idea. After Korn started to come out and started to have success in the second half of the 1990s, you couldn't go into a Guitar Center store without seeing a whole row of 7-string guitars on the wall. It became the most, in many ways, the sort of the biggest trend, or an important trend anyway, in guitar playing by the end of the decade. Heavy, angular, distortion-soaked riffs, you know, sort of coming out of the heavy metal tradition, but the singing is often rapped. And when it's not rapped, it can be screamed, right? And so there's a sort of a blending of a kind of rap vocal with a kind of screamed vocal. The important records for Korn during the 1990s, Life is Peachy, a number 3 album here in 1996, and Follow the Leader, a number 1 album here in 1998, number 5 in the UK. Picking up on what Korn had done, Limp Bizkit, coming out of Jacksonville, Florida, features Fred Durst on the vocals, Wes Borland on the guitar, more 7-string, and more screaming. Important albums for them, $3 Bill Ya All from 1997, and their number 1 album from 1999, Significant Other. We talked before about Rick Rubin and how he had produced a number of groups that we've talked about during this course. Here he is producing a group out of Glendale, California called System of a Down, who combine elements of the political engagement of Rage Against the Machine with the kind of heavy sounds of Korn and Limp Bizkit. Their 1998 debut, entitled simply System of a Down, sort of gives the blueprint of the way they're going to sound. But then they have in 2001, sort of out of the 90s, I realize, but it's a continuation of this rap and rock thing. 2001, they have a #1 album with a record called Toxicity. This next artist I'm going to talk about with regard to rap and rock fusion, we don't today think of very much as being a kind of, is really sort of fitting in very well with these other groups that I've been talking about. But this is sort of where he originally came from. Coming out of Detroit, Michigan, Kid Rock really was one of the guys in this movement initially. His first album, a #4 album called Devil Without a Cause, or his first big charting album from 1998, kind of extends the rap rock thing, but also branches into other styles. So with Kid Rock, you're likely to find fewer of the sort of heavy guitar licks influenced by heavy metal, and maybe more blues rock kind of licks and even country kinds of things. And Kid Rock, in the time since he sort of broke through at the end of the 90s, has become maybe more of a mainstream kind of rock artist, more in a more kind of traditional vein than it initially appeared at the beginning of his career, but this is sort of where he comes from. Another big sort of heavy metal extension or alternative extension we can talk about is a style that's often called industrial. In this case, I'm going to give you just a kind of a brief survey, mostly centered around two groups, Nine Inch Nails and Marilyn Manson. But let's talk a little bit about the origins of the industrial sound, which is kind of blends electronic sources, that is taped and synthesizer kinds of sources, with live performance, sort of blending them together, very much driven by conceptual art. So there's always sort of ideas behind this music, things that are trying to be represented, or ideas that are trying to be sort of made to happen through the music, whether they're emotional ideas or structural ideas, something like that. There's a lot of anti-conformity. The music turns out to be very, in some cases, very sort of avant-garde sounding, but also sometimes pretty disturbing. They've got the industrial has its roots in in UK bands Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire. If you go back into the 70s and listen to some of that, you'll hear the roots of industrial. Also in the 1980s, a Canadian band called Skinny Puppy. With all of that sort of being the background, we get the arrival of Nine Inch Nails in 1994, a group, well, really a guy out of San Francisco, Trent Reznor, who basically did the albums himself, and then when he toured, he would bring musicians with him. The album, The Downward Spiral, note that it's a downward spiral, right? There's something very sort of dark and brooding about this music. The Downward Spiral was a #2 album here, #9 in the UK in 1994. The music is moody, frequent shifts in atmosphere, very dark. Just to give you an idea of sort of Trent Reznor's sort of frame of mind as he was doing this music, that album, The Downward Spiral, was actually recorded in the house where the Charles Manson followers killed Sharon Tate and all those other people. You know that terrible story about these terrible murders. Well, I mean, so fascinated with the darker side of things is Trent Reznor that he decides that would be a fantastic place to record an album. And so he's trying to pick up on some of the vibe of that horror, of the sort of dark psychology of what would draw people to do things like that. Another artist, very similar in a lot of ways and very closely associated with Trent Reznor, is Marilyn Manson, originally coming out of Canton, Ohio. Not such a dark place. Actually, Canton is a pretty nice town. Going to college in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and sort of getting this group together, Marilyn Manson. Well, if you know Marilyn Manson's image and Marilyn Manson's music, you know that, and you know something about Alice Cooper. There's a very, very strong parallel. Alice Cooper, you know, a lead singer, very dark, sort of gothic, scary, outrageous, takes the name of a woman, but it's a man. And then we get, in the 1990s, Marilyn Manson, a very similar kind of thing. A real fascination with the grotesque, as we saw, and especially early Alice Cooper. After about the middle of the 70s, Alice Cooper becomes a little bit sort of camp and ironic. But, you know, in the first half, albums like Love It to Death and Killer, Alice Cooper was one scary hombre. And in many ways, Marilyn Manson is sort of bringing all of that back. But there's also with Marilyn Manson, as there sometimes was with Alice Cooper, a kind of hint of the absurd. So for example, when he puts the group together, he decides that every member in the band should have the name of a female star, famous female star, put together with the name of a famous serial killer. So the keyboard player, for example, is renamed Madonna Wayne Gacy. Right? So there's a certain sort of absurd engagement with the grotesque. Albums are produced by Trent Reznor, so that's what I meant about the kind of close connection between Marilyn Manson and Trent Reznor. The third album from 1996, Antichrist Superstar, was a number 3 album for Marilyn Manson. And the next one, Mechanical Albums from 1998, did even better, going to number 1 in this country, number 8 in the UK. Of course, Marilyn Manson and his antics outraged conservative America. And he's the kind of artist that just delights in poking any stick he can find in the eyes of people who he might likely be able to offend. So he, in order to offend the more sort of conservative, culturally conservative elements of our culture, he kind of dressed like a ghoulish transvestite, not unlike in many ways Alice Cooper. And the albums contain vulgar and satanic lyrics that just beg to be banned. The albums basically say, please ban me on radio. I want to be a famous bad boy. And Marilyn Manson has, in large part, very much succeeded at that, and is really revered by his fans as being somebody who is, as I said before about industrial, very anti-conformity. It's anti-conformity in your face, trying to offend you with all those kinds of things you're not supposed to talk about, doing all those kinds of things you're not supposed to do. Well, having now sort of talked a bit about metal and alternative extensions of the 1990s, let's follow the thread out of hip-hop in the 1980s. We talked a bit about what was happening as we got to the end of the 1980s and hip-hop began to fracture into a lot of different kinds of styles. So let's pick that up and in the next video talk about hip-hop in the 1990s.